Rayleigh had never felt so small. The wind howled through the canyons, stirring the dust at her feet. The sky stretched endlessly above her, painted in the deep purples and burnt oranges of twilight. Somewhere in the distance, a storm rumbled, a low and ominous growl against the silence between them. She was kneeling, her hands trembled, pressed against the cracked earth, her long white hair whipping in the wind. She was humbling herself before a human, a species she barely understood, a species she had once been taught to view as crude, primitive, and barely civilized. And yet here she was, voice raw with desperation. "Marry me." The words left her mouth before she could rethink them, before pride could stop her. Dan froze. He had been shifting his pack higher onto his shoulder, adjusting the worn leather strap, but at her words his movement stilled. His stance, once relaxed, went rigid. He was staring at her not with mockery, not even with disgust, just sheer stunned disbelief. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "I'm sorry." "What?" Rayleigh felt heat rise beneath her green skin, a deep flush of humiliation. It was a mistake to ask. She should have known better. She forced herself to stand, ignoring the sting in her knees. "Forget it." Her voice was sharp, but it did nothing to mask the way her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Dan didn't move, his brows furrowing. He was taller than her, broad-shouldered, his dark hair tousled from the wind. His clothing was worn, patched in places, a man accustomed to hardship, a survivor. And yet she had no idea how he had survived alone. He studied her, his eyes scanning her face, the tension in her stance, the way she wouldn't meet his gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "That's not exactly how this usually works." His tone wasn't mocking, but that didn't make the words sting any less. Rayleigh exhaled slowly, gripping the edges of her cloak as if it could shield her from her own foolishness. "I know." "Then why ask?" She hesitated. The truth was bitter, and saying it aloud felt like carving open an old wound. But what choice did she have? "My people abandoned me." The words came out steadier than she expected. "I am a widow." Dan's expression shifted just slightly, but she caught it, a flicker of something between confusion and concern. He crossed his arms. "And that's a reason to." "Yes." She cut him off before he could finish the question. "Among my kind, a widow is a burden, a body with no purpose. They left me here, alone, because to them I am already dead." A gust of wind swept between them, carrying the faint scent of alien flora, sharp and herbal with an underlying bitterness. Dan inhaled as if considering her words, then let out a slow breath. "That's..." She blinked. Of all the responses she had expected, that was not one of them. "It's tradition," she said flatly. "It's stupid," he countered. His voice was firm, but not cruel. "You don't just throw people away like that." A strange sensation curled in her chest. No one had ever questioned it before, not her people, not even herself. The rules of her world had been absolute until now. Dan's gaze flickered to her hands, still clenched at her sides. When he spoke again, there was something different in his tone. "Is that why you asked me?" Rayleigh forced herself to meet his eyes. "I don't want to die." There, the truth lay bare between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sky was darkening, the storm creeping closer, a distant flash of lightning illuminating the jagged rock formations. The wind had turned colder. Dan shifted again, this time rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I don't know how your kind does things, but humans don't really just." He stopped himself, exhaling. "Marriage means something to us." A bitter smile tugged at Rayleigh's lips. "It meant something to me too." Something in the way she said it made him pause. His arms dropped to his sides, his posture losing some of its stiffness. "Who was he?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned her gaze to the horizon, where the last remnants of sunlight painted the canyon edges in gold. "A good man." Her voice was softer now. "But that didn't matter." Dan nodded slowly, as if piecing things together in his mind. She expected more questions, but none came. Instead, he took a step forward, just one. A part of her wanted to step back, to retreat into the safety of distance, but she didn't move. He reached for his pack again, adjusting the strap absent-mindedly. "Look, really, I don't know what you've been through, but I do know one thing." He raised a brow. "And what is that?" "You're not nothing." The words hit harder than she wanted them to. For a long time, she had believed she was. Even now, the ghost of that belief lingered. But here stood a human, a man, with no reason to care, telling her otherwise. She wasn't sure if that made him naive or dangerous, or maybe it made him different. She turned away, but as she did, their hands brushed, a fleeting touch. His skin was rough, warm, the calluses telling stories she did not know. The contact lasted only a heartbeat, but the sensation lingered like a whisper against her senses. Dan inhaled sharply, barely noticeable, but she caught it. She pulled away first, fingers curling slightly as if holding on to something that was no longer there. The storm was moving in fast now. Soon, they would have to find shelter. But for the first time since being left behind, really realized something. She was no longer completely alone. The first sign of danger was the silence. The wind, once howling through the canyon, stilled. The distant hum of nocturnal creatures faded into nothingness. The air itself felt heavier, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. Really knew what that meant. She stood rigid, her sharp gaze sweeping the darkened cliffs above them. The storm had passed, leaving the sky raw with streaks of silver light. Dan was a few steps ahead, adjusting the straps of his pack, his human senses too dull to notice what she had. "We need to move," she said, voice tight. Dan glanced over his shoulder. "That was fast. You just asked me to." "Not because of that." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Something is watching us." His posture shifted immediately, just a slight change, but enough to tell her he was listening now. He didn't argue or demand an explanation. Instead, he followed her gaze toward the cliffs. A shadow moved. Dan barely had time to react before a guttural snarl ripped through the night and the creature leaped. Really shoved him aside as the beast struck the ground where he had been standing. A skeletal frame covered in pale leathery skin. Too many limbs, too many eyes. A scavenger, drawn by the scent of vulnerability. Dan hit the ground but recovered fast. His hand went to his belt, drawing a blade, small, primitive, but wielded with the confidence of someone who had used it before. The creature lunged again. Relay moved first. Years of training, of instinct, took over. She twisted, dodging its claws, and struck with the precision of her kind. Her fingers found the gap between its ribs where a heart should have been. But the beast did not fall. It only screamed. She barely had time to register the mistake before it retaliated. Claws raked across her arm, tearing through fabric and into skin. She gasped, stumbling back, warmth blooming against her sleeve. Dan was already moving. He didn't hesitate. He didn't freeze. He simply stepped between her and the creature, gripping his knife tighter. Then, to her horror, he did something utterly reckless. He lunged. Humans were slow, weak. They did not have the agility of her kind, nor the endurance of predators like this. But Dan moved with a different kind of efficiency, raw, unrefined, and relentless. The scavenger struck, claws slicing through the air. He didn't dodge. He caught the limb mid-swipe, gritting his teeth as it cut into his palm. Then, with a sharp, brutal motion, he twisted. A sickening crack echoed through the canyon. The creature reeled back, screeching in pain. Dan didn't stop. He slammed his knee into its torso, then drove the blade into its throat. The struggle ended in seconds. The scavenger gurgled once, then slumped lifeless. Relay stared. She had never seen a human fight like that. Barbaric, inelegant, nothing like the fluid, calculated combat her people had mastered. But it had worked. Dan exhaled, yanking his knife free. He wiped the blade against his sleeve before turning to her. "You okay?" Blood dripped from his hand where the creature had sliced his palm. His expression was unreadable. She swallowed hard, pressing a hand against her own wound. "You could have died." "So could you." She frowned, unsure what to make of the way he said it, so matter-of-fact, as if it were just a simple exchange of risks. Dan stepped closer, reaching for her arm. She tensed, instinct warning her against contact, but he ignored her hesitation, taking her wrist gently and pulling back the torn fabric. "It's deep," he muttered, inspecting the wound. "I will heal," she said, trying to pull away. He didn't let go. She was about to protest when he did something unexpected. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small clear container, unscrewing the lid. He dipped his fingers inside and spread a thick, pungent salve over her wound. She hissed at the sting. "What is that?" she demanded. "Antiseptic," he said, as if it were obvious. "Stops infection." Relay watched him, baffled. Among her kind, healing was left to time or specialized medics. A wound like this would have been treated with silence and endurance. But Dan, he had simply fixed it. Humans were strange. She found herself staring at him longer than she should have, studying the set of his jaw, the roughness of his hands. He had fought for her. He had tended her wounds. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something unfamiliar, safe. Dan secured a bandage around her arm with practiced ease, then pulled back, meeting her gaze. "We should find shelter," he said. She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, not on the scavengers, not on survival, but on the man who had just fought a monster for her. The fire crackled, sending tiny embers swirling into the night air. Their glow flickered against the rocky walls of the alcove, illuminating the tight space that barely shielded them from the cold. Outside, the canyon stretched into darkness, the wind carrying distant sounds, shifting rocks, the rustle of unseen creatures, the quiet hum of a world that never truly slept. Relay sat with her back against the stone, her injured arm resting in her lap. The bandage Dan had wrapped around it was rough, but the warmth of his hands had lingered long after he finished. She shouldn't have noticed, shouldn't have let herself feel anything about it, but the sensation had stayed with her, an uninvited awareness she couldn't seem to shake. Across from her, Dan adjusted the straps of his pack, checking his supplies with the quiet efficiency of someone who had lived on the edge of survival for far too long. His movements were methodical, practiced. He had done this before, tended to wounds, rationed supplies, calculated the risks of an unfamiliar world. She had watched him fight, seen him bleed, and still, here he was, acting as if none of it had mattered. "You should rest," he said without looking up. She scoffed. "I don't sleep easily." Dan glanced at her, his dark eyes studying her face. "Because of them." She stiffened. He meant her people, the ones who had left her behind. Really shifted slightly, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Because of everything." She expected him to pry further, to ask more questions, but he didn't. Instead, he sighed and leaned back against the stone, stretching out his legs. The firelight softened his features, casting sharp angles into something almost gentle. "You're not the only one who has trouble sleeping," he admitted. Really tilted her head, curious despite herself. "Why?" Dan hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. Then with a slow exhale, he said, "Because I've spent too many nights waiting for something to kill me." His voice was even, but there was something in it, something worn and weathered, a truth too familiar to be spoken lightly. She watched him in silence. "I don't know what it's like for your kind," Dan continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "But for humans, survival isn't guaranteed. We don't have enhanced strength or superior senses. We don't live in perfectly structured societies that decide everything for us. We survive because we fight." Relay frowned. "So do my people." He turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze. "Do they?" His meaning was clear. If they had truly fought for one another, she wouldn't be here, abandoned in the dust. She looked away. Not for those who are deemed unworthy. Dan was quiet for a moment. Then softly, he asked, "Did you love him?" Her breath caught in her throat. The question shouldn't have surprised her, but it did. She had spoken of being a widow, had given him enough pieces of her past to understand that there had been someone before, but this was the first time he had asked about the man she had lost, not just the weight of her widowhood, but the person who had once stood beside her. She should have lied. It would have been easier. But something about the fire, the silence, the way Dan watched her without expectation or judgment, it pulled the truth from her like a thread unraveling. "I thought I did," she murmured. Dan didn't interrupt. Relay swallowed, tightening her grip on her cloak. "We were bonded because it was expected." He was kind, but kindness is not the same as love. She exhaled slowly, as if the confession itself were exhausting. "I mourned him not because he was mine, but because I didn't know what else to do." Dan shifted slightly, his expression unreadable. "And now?" "Now," she said, "I mourn what I never had." The words hung between them, weighty and raw. She had never spoken them aloud before. She wasn't sure why she had spoken them now. Dan ran a hand over his face, exhaling through his nose. "You know," he said after a beat, "you talk like someone who already believes they're dead." Riley's lips pressed into a thin line. "A widow is not meant to have a future. That's the biggest load off," he stopped, "I've ever heard." She blinked at him. "You don't understand." "No," he said, leveling her with a look that was too sharp, too knowing. "I do understand. I understand what it's like to lose everything and still be standing. I understand what it's like to be told you're nothing and having to decide for yourself if that's true." Her chest tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever challenged what she had accepted as fact. And what unsettled her most of all was that a part of her wanted to believe him. She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers slightly. "Your people are strange." Dan snorted. "That's the first honest thing you've said all night." Despite herself, a small, fleeting smile tugged at her lips. Dan shifted, rolling his shoulder, wincing slightly at the movement. She frowned. "You're still hurt." "It's fine." "It's not." She reached forward before she could stop herself, her fingers brushing against his arm. Dan stilled. The touch was light, barely there, but the reaction was immediate. The space between them seemed to shrink, the fire flickering between their faces, casting shadows along the planes of his jaw. His skin was warm beneath her fingertips, too warm. She had known humans ran hotter than their kind, but feeling it directly, feeling him, was something else entirely. She should have pulled away, but she didn't. Her fingers lingered just for a breath longer than necessary, as if testing something neither of them fully understood. Dan's gaze flickered to her face, searching. He didn't speak. Neither did she. And in that moment, for the first time in her life, Riley felt something unfamiliar settled deep in her chest. Safe. She drew her hand back slowly, carefully, before either of them could acknowledge the weight of what had just passed between them. Dan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Get some rest." She nodded, but they both knew neither of them would sleep. Outside, the wind continued to howl, the canyon stretching into darkness. But here, in this quiet space between fire and shadow, Riley wasn't alone, and that terrified her more than anything. The first raindrop landed on Riley's cheek, cool against her flushed skin. She barely noticed at first, too focused on the warmth still lingering on her lips. The kiss had been unexpected, sudden, and yet it had felt inevitable. Now, as the sky cracked open above them, the soft drizzle quickly turning into a relentless downpour, reality came rushing back. The rain hit the canyon floor in a steady rhythm, a sharp contrast to the pounding of her heart. Dan was still close, so close she could feel his breath mixing with the storm-chilled air. He had barely moved since the moment their lips had parted, his dark eyes locked onto hers, searching for something she wasn't sure she could name. Riley took a step back, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. Her pulse was erratic, her thoughts tangled. She had spent so long keeping people at a distance, convincing herself that bonds were nothing but chains waiting to tighten around her throat. But Dan, he was undoing everything she thought she knew. She shouldn't have kissed him. But worse, she wanted to do it again. Dan finally broke the silence, his voice quieter than usual, as if afraid speaking too loudly would shatter whatever fragile thing had formed between them. "You okay?" She forced herself to nod, though the answer felt hollow. "We should find shelter." He studied her for a moment longer, then glanced up at the sky, blinking against the rain. "Yeah, looks like we're in for a long one." Without another word, he grabbed her hand, not tightly, not like he was pulling her, but as if it was the most natural thing in the world, like he had done it 100 times before. Riley didn't pull away. The storm intensified as they moved, the wind cutting through the canyon, carrying the scent of wet stone and something electric. She barely registered the cold creeping into her bones, too distracted by the warmth of Dan's palm against hers. They found an overhang not far from where they had camped the night before, a shallow cave carved into the rock, barely enough space to keep them dry. Dan ducked inside first, shaking the water from his hair before dropping his pack near the entrance. Rila hesitated before stepping in after him, her cloak soaked through, strands of her white hair clinging to her face. Dan didn't say anything as he shrugged off his jacket. The fabric was just as drenched as the rest of him, but that didn't stop him from holding it out to her. She frowned. "You need it more than I do." "You're freezing," he countered. "So are you." He huffed out a breath, half amused, half frustrated. "Really, just take the damn thing." She hesitated for only a second before grabbing it, wrapping it around herself. It smelled like him, earthy, warm, something she couldn't quite name but recognized all the same. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the steady patter of rain against the stone. Dan leaned against the cavern wall, watching her, his expression unreadable. "You're quiet." Riley exhaled, her fingers curling into the fabric of his jacket. "I don't know what to say." Regretting it, she looked up sharply, meeting his gaze. "No." Something in his face eased. "Good." Her grip on the jacket tightened. "But that doesn't mean I understand it." Dan studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You ever let yourself want something, really? Not because you needed it, not because it was expected, just because it was yours to take." She didn't answer right away, because the truth was she hadn't. Not once. Not ever. Her life had been built on duty, on survival, on fulfilling a role that had been decided for her long before she ever had a choice. Even her past bond had not been hers to claim. It had been arranged, inevitable, a path carved out long before she had even learned what love was supposed to feel like. She swallowed hard. "And if I say no?" Dan tilted his head slightly, considering her. "Then I'd say maybe it's time you did." Her chest ached at the simplicity of his words, the idea that she could take something, that she could reach for something without consequence, without expectation. It terrified her because she knew that if she reached for Dan, if she let herself have this, she would never be able to let it go. The fire between them hadn't burned out. It had only just begun. The rain continued to fall outside, the world beyond their small shelter nothing but mist and darkness, and yet she had never felt more seen than she did in that moment, standing there in silence with a man who had no reason to stay and yet did. Dan took a step forward, closing the small distance between them. He was cautious, slow, as if giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His fingers found her chin first, tilting her face up toward his. Her breath hitched, heart pounding as his thumb brushed against her jaw, barely there but enough to set her entire body alight. "This is yours to take," he murmured, voice low, steady. "No one else gets to decide that." And this time, when she kissed him, it was because she chose to. The fire had burned low, its last embers pulsing with fading warmth. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air damp and thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. The only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the cave stone ceiling and the slow, steady rhythm of Dan's breathing beside her. It should have felt peaceful. It didn't. Relay sat on the cold ground, arms wrapped around her knees, her mind a tangled mess of thoughts she didn't want to have. Across from her, Dan sat with his back against the rock wall, absently turning his knife over in his hands. He hadn't said much since the kiss the night before. He hadn't needed to. The weight of what had happened between them hung heavy in the air. Relay hadn't meant to let things go this far. She had spent so long convincing herself she didn't deserve this, couldn't have this. But then he had looked at her like she wasn't something broken. Then he had touched her like she was something worth holding on to. And she had let him. That was the problem. Dan's voice broke the silence, quiet but firm. You've been staring at the same spot for the past 20 minutes. Relay blinked, snapping out of her thoughts. I was thinking. Yeah, he said. About what? She hesitated. Nothing important, she said instead. Dan studied her, dark eyes sharp even in the dim firelight. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. You do that a lot. She frowned. Do what? Decide what is and isn't important for me. She looked away, fingers curling into the fabric of her cloak. I'm not. You are, he said simply. She hated how sure he sounded. Dan set his knife aside, leaning forward slightly. If you regret it, last night, I mean. I don't. The words left her lips too fast, too forceful. Something in his expression shifted. Good. Her chest tightened. But that doesn't mean I understand it. Dan tilted his head slightly, considering her. You ever let yourself want something, really? Not because it was necessary, not because it was expected, just because it was yours to take. She inhaled sharply, because the truth was, no, she hadn't. Not once. Her entire life had been dictated by duty, by rules she hadn't written, by expectations she had been born into. Even her past bond had not been a choice. It had been an arrangement, a practical union with no room for desire. She had mourned because it was expected of her. She had grieved because she hadn't known what else to do. But she had never truly wanted anything for herself until now, and that terrified her. She swallowed, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. And if I say no? Dan didn't look away. Then I'd say maybe it's time you did. Reilly's throat tightened. This is dangerous. His lips quirked into a half-smile. Yeah, well, I've never been good at playing it safe. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. I can tell. Dan huffed, running a hand through his damp hair. Look, really, if you want to walk away from this, whatever this is, I won't stop you. But don't pretend it's because of me. Her stomach twisted. You're still trying to keep me at a distance, he said. I get it. You think this is temporary, that I'll get tired of fighting for you. But here's the thing. You don't get to decide that for me. Her pulse pounded in her ears. No, his voice was quiet but firm. You don't get to push me away just because you're scared. Her hands curled into fists. I am not scared. Dan took a step closer. Yes, you are. She wanted to argue, wanted to throw his words back at him, but she couldn't because he was right. She was terrified of how much she wanted this, of what it meant, of what it could take from her. She had spent so long convincing herself she was nothing, that she had nothing left to offer. And now here he was, looking at her like she was worth something, like she was worth choosing. But people didn't choose her. They left her. She turned away, forcing herself to speak past the tightness in her throat. If I stay, you'll only get hurt. Dan let out a breath, shaking his head. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't already accepted that? His voice softened. You asked me to marry you. She flinched. That night felt like a lifetime ago. Dan stepped closer, his voice steady. You asked me to bond with you because you thought it would save your life. And now what? You think leaving me is going to protect me?" He scoffed. "You can't have it both ways, really." She turned to face him, chest tightening. That was different, because then she had needed someone. Now she wanted him. And that was far more dangerous. Dan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "All right," he said finally. "Then let me choose." She swallowed hard. "I'm not asking for a promise," he continued. "I'm not asking for forever. But I am here, and I'm not walking away unless you make me." Her breath caught. She could do it. She could push him away, break whatever fragile connection had formed between them. But as she looked at him, standing there in the dim firelight, his expression open and unguarded, she realized something terrifying. She didn't want him to leave, and that scared her more than anything. Dan must have seen something in her face because his expression softened, his posture relaxing just slightly. And then, cautiously, he reached for her. His fingers brushed against her cheek first, warm and solid, grounding her when she felt like she was about to break apart. She inhaled sharply but didn't pull away. Dan hesitated, giving her a chance to stop him. She didn't, so he closed the distance. The kiss was different from the first, slower, deeper, less about urgency, more about certainty. His hand slipped into her hair, fingers tangling in the damp strands, and she shivered, though not from the cold. She wasn't running anymore. Not this time. The night was too quiet. Rayleigh had learned to recognize the warning signs of danger long ago. The way the wind stilled, the way the distant sounds of the canyon, shifting rocks, the rustle of unseen creatures, suddenly faded into silence. Predators knew how to wait. She stood at the mouth of the cave, gripping her blade tightly, scanning the darkness beyond their makeshift shelter. The sky above was an endless stretch of black, the stars barely visible behind the lingering storm clouds. Something was coming. Behind her, Dan stirred. "You're tense," he said, voice thick with sleep. She didn't look back. "We're not alone." That woke him up fast. She heard the rustle of fabric as he pushed himself upright, the quiet metallic click of him checking his rifle. "How many?" She narrowed her eyes, trying to listen beyond the silence. A faint tremor in the ground, a distant guttural snarl. "Too many." Dan exhaled, standing. "Great." She finally turned to face him, her stomach twisting at the sight of the dried blood on his bandaged arm. The wound from the last fight hadn't fully healed, and now they were about to be thrown into another. "You shouldn't be fighting like this," she murmured. Dan gave her a tired smirk. "Not really an option, is it?" Before she could argue, a deafening howl shattered the quiet, echoing through the canyon walls like a war cry. The ground trembled beneath them. Then movement. Dark figures slithered between the rocks, their skeletal limbs bending at unnatural angles. Too many limbs, too many eyes. Scavengers. Raleigh's grip tightened on her blade. "They found us." Dan was already moving, positioning himself near the entrance, rifle raised. "Then let's make sure they regret it." The first one lunged from the shadows. Rayleigh moved instinctively, her body a blur of motion as she ducked under the creature's swinging claws and drove her blade deep into its chest. A sharp, wet gurgle escaped its throat before it crumpled to the ground. Another was already leaping toward Dan. He fired a single, precise shot. The scavenger's body jerked before collapsing, its eerie glow fading from its lifeless eyes. For a moment, there was silence. Then, as if the canyon itself had been holding its breath, the rest of the pack emerged. A dozen at least, their blackened silhouettes barely visible against the rocks, their eyes gleaming like embers in the dark. Raleigh's pulse quickened. This was worse than she had anticipated. Dan let out a slow breath. "Well, that's a problem. No time for jokes." He smirked. "It's how I cope." Then they attacked. Rayleigh barely had time to register the wave of movement before she was fighting again, her blade flashing as she cut through the nearest creature. Claws raked across her arms, slicing through fabric and skin, but she didn't slow down. She couldn't. Beside her, Dan was holding his ground. He moved with a brutal efficiency, no wasted motions, no hesitation. His rifle fired again and again, dropping anything that got too close. But for everyone they killed, more kept coming. Too many. A shadow loomed at the edge of her vision. Riley turned just in time to see one of the creatures leap toward Dan from behind. He didn't see it. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She threw herself between them. Sharp, searing pain cut through her ribs as claws tore into her side. She gasped, her vision swimming, but she didn't let herself fall. The creature snarled, snapping its jaws at her throat, but she twisted, plunging her blade up into its chest. A sickening crunch. The scavenger shuddered once, then collapsed. Dan was on her in an instant. Riley. She wavered on her feet, breath coming fast. The wound burned, hot and deep, but she forced herself to stay upright. "I'm fine," she lied. Dan caught her before she could stumble. "You're not fine." His voice was sharp, edged with something dangerously close to panic. "You just took a hit meant for me." She exhaled shakily. "You would have died." Dan's jaw tightened. "And what? You think I'd be okay if you did?" She didn't have an answer for that. His grip on her tightened. "Damn it, Riley." The low growl behind them cut the moment short. One of the scavengers was still alive.